This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, audience, and welcome back to this week's episode of Gals Who Gab with your hosts, Allie, Gabby, and Miss Kitten Cove.
In our last episode, we discussed how the installment of food pantries in the Massachusetts public schools would help lower the crime rates across the state.
In this week's episode, we're going to talk about Massachusetts' newest social policy regarding free lunches and breakfasts in public schools.
So, Allie, what exactly is social policy?
A social policy is basically a piece of legislation that is passed that changes a pre-existing social order. And this social policy utilizes the government to change behaviors amongst a society by implementing different legislation, therefore influencing the society's behaviors due to these new rules.
Right. And so, what are the elements of the social policy that we are looking at today?
Today, we are going to look at the recent change Massachusetts has made in switching school lunches to be free for all students attending public schools. The National School Lunch Act provides free breakfast and lunches to all students attending public schools. Previously, this was only an option for low-income families, but through this policy, all students will receive the benefits regardless of household income.
Oh, wow. How has this policy changed behaviors amongst the different communities?
This policy allows for students to receive breakfast and lunch regardless of whether they can afford it. This would allow for the shame and embarrassment aspect of not being able to afford lunch to be non-existent, which overall would allow for less alienation of those students to happen within peer groups. As we know, while in school, it is a particular time when peer groups are important to the development of a child. Being alienated from such would then perhaps lead them to start skipping school, which in itself is a crime, but during that time, start committing crime, such as stealing for fun or stealing to help fulfill their need for nourishment that they're not quite getting at home, and if they can't afford it, not getting at school. This policy would also allow for the parents that do have low income that may have been right above the limit of getting the free lunches for their children to spend that money on other things such as bills and weekend foods. This would allow for less stress for parents, which creates a better atmosphere for the child and the parent in the household. This would lead to less violence within the household. As we know, copious amounts of stress could lead to violent disputes, and this would just kind of diminish the possibility of that happening.
And as we know, legislation can sometimes be difficult to read and understand. What do you think is important for legislation, especially policies that have a great impact on society, to have language that most people can understand?
I think it is important for social policies to have a language that is understandable, as it's the entire point of them is for the people within a society to utilize the legislation. Without easy-to-read language, policies can be misconstrued or misinterpreted, which would lead to more disagreements about what the policy is meant to do rather than the policy doing its job and fixing what needs to be fixed. I also think that it is important so the people understand what they are gaining from a policy change. A lot of the time, policies that policy changes take time to adapt to, and without them being easy to understand, the transition for the people would be more difficult and may never truly take effect in the way it was intended. We hope that you have thoroughly enjoyed, unfortunately, our last installment of Gals Who Gab for this semester.
I am just in tears.
I am also really upset by this, but it's okay. We'll be back at some other point.
Of course.
As always, we are your hosts, Allie, Gabby, and our special guest star, Miss Kitten Cove, and we hope that you had a wonderful time listening and tuning in to Gals Who Gab. Good night.
Good night.